Hi, everyone. My name is Melius. I'm a solution architect here at Logicalis, and I'm joined by Andrew Hertenstein, who is a principal architect, and we are looking to share with you some exciting information around the acceleration and the adoption empowered by Azure VMware Solution, also known as AVS. We've got some fun things to share with you, so let's get started. On our agenda today, first, we are going to talk about the top cloud native migration challenges, review that around AVS and where it makes sense. And then we'll also talk to you about Logicalis's production ready cloud, or PRC, with AVS. Then we'll spend some time talking about multi-cloud management, leveraging Azure Arc. And then we'll also share with you how you can take this into action with the Logicalis solutions today. And of course, we'll wrap everything up with some Q&A. And so let's get started. When we talk about challenges within migration and adopting of native solutions, many organizations that are looking to adapt and to migrate and to modernize those workloads into clouds such as Azure or the like, often customers are looking for greater agility and faster go-to-market types of situations for new applications and offerings that they may be providing to their customers. Perhaps it's global availability and security posture, but these can present individual challenges, whether it be around a specific technology or a particular platform. IT teams struggle with education, for example, on these new platforms. Perhaps it's high upfront costs for refactoring, migrating, or revalidating. And Andrew, I'm just curious if you can maybe share with us a little bit, when you talk with customers as a principal architect, what kinds of challenges do you find that customers are having? Is it compatibility around systems, for example?
Oh, absolutely. There's several different factors. I mean, if we kind of talk a little bit about what the use case for AVS is and what our common theme is when we hear from our customers, a lot of times they have a necessity that they need to very quickly maybe evacuate a data center, or they want to stretch their legs and start leveraging the cloud for different services. But, like you had mentioned before, a lot of times IT teams aren't prepared and ready to necessarily go to the cloud natively. If you think about, let's take something, for example, you might have some disparate systems, some older things that are not compatible to be able to run within Azure directly, but VMware supports. There's actually a compatibility matrix for some of the older operating systems, SQL workloads, older versions of Linux and Unix and things like that they support on their platform, but Azure native doesn't support it. So when we talk about IT teams, it's not just from necessarily from the education perspective and them being able to leverage these new platform services. It can ultimately come down to system compatibility. That's a very, very big issue that we see.
Is that kind of like an operational process, or are we talking about change control type of processes?
It really can be all of it. When we think about, a larger organization, let's just take somebody who's typically very good in the data center that wants to leverage the cloud. Let's talk healthcare, for example. Just throwing this out there real quick. They have a very standardized, very stringent change control process and an operational model that they're used to working in. They got a lot of compliance reasons to maintain what they have and very slowly adopt those changes, change control process, operational changes, and even platform changes. They have to move much slower, but they can't sit there in this same necessarily expensive data centers, which typically that's what we see. We see a higher operational changes. We see customers that want to be lower in their green footprint, the carbon footprint type thing. So they want to start moving to the cloud. They can't support it from a business perspective. So that's a good point. Those operational and change control processes, it's very important that they get their hands wrapped around that. If we take AVS, for example, basically, and we're going to get into more detail on this, this is a bare metal deployment of VMware on Azure hardware. Okay, so you're able to take the existing, in essence, take your existing VMware investment on-prem and extend it and connect it to Azure VMware Solution. So it, in essence, looks like one big giant cloud Okay, we're all running VMware. You're used to using all your same native tools with VMware and extending that directly into Azure. So now all I'm doing is simply moving it from basically one cluster that would typically be in a data center and moving it to a cluster that's hosted directly in Azure. So it makes it a lot simple to just extend that data center than it is to necessarily complement what you're doing on-prem by using cloud native.
Sounds like there's challenges, but you guys have come up with a way to simplify that. Could you maybe walk us through that?
Absolutely. You know, one thing I'm going to throw out too, one last piece I'll throw out before I kind of take over and talk more of the technical side of the house is, you know, we do find that customers also have more on-prem solutions that they're used to using, Veeam, for example, or a certain management and monitoring tool or security control tools, things like that, that maybe are not quite Azure native ready when you're running those workloads. By us extending VMware out there, it still allows the customer to continue to maintain those management tools and security tools. So yeah,
incompatible now becomes compatible.
It pretty much exactly. So if you think about legacy systems that are not supported cloud native, when you think about IT's educational side of the house where they're not quite ready on a knowledge perspective, change control processes, operational models, perhaps a software vendor is not ready to leverage cloud native tooling, things like that. Now we're able to still leverage Azure, but we just pick it up and we extend it. That's all we're able to do. And we can move things from on-prem to the cloud and back and forth. So it makes it a lot easier for us to go to market faster and leverage the cloud and try to start getting out of that, the data center side and things like that. A use case, a typical use case I do see a lot of times, Aaron, is we have customers that say, we've got these 2, 3, 4 data centers. And they say, you know, this may be a redundant data center that we'd like to retire in the next 12, 24, 36 months. But we're a big VMware shop. We have a very heavy investment there. So how can we start looking at the smaller stuff and start getting that to the cloud? We've seen customers where they're like, hey, we've got 2 data centers. They're 52 miles away from each other. That doesn't really give you a good presence in a DR capacity. So being able to maybe use AVS to eliminate that data center that doesn't really give you that disaster recovery scenario from a regional perspective. Now we can run that in another region and give you more geographical separation. These are some of the common use cases that I typically see when we start talking about AVS.
It sounds pretty exciting. Let's take a look. What do you got?
All right. So let's talk a little bit about understanding ultimately what AVS is. Okay. So today in your current data center, you're used to running your vCenter, vSphere, vSAN, NSX, all that stuff in your own data center. You own it, or maybe even in a colo. I don't care really where it runs. These are the tools you're used to leveraging. Well, what you actually do is you replicate that exact infrastructure and you're running it on dedicated hardware that is running within an Azure data center that is running vCenter, vSphere, vSAN, NSX, all of that stuff. So the nice thing about having this is we've got this build in Azure, so we're able to leverage all of that capability and extend your on-prem VMware environment directly into AVS. The most important things that we have to do, though, is we've got to get that foundation of Azure actually built. We have to get the connectivity between your data center and Azure. So we typically use something like what we refer to as an express route connection. Yeah, you could use some site-to-site VPN, but that's awfully slow to do that. There's many different ways to actually set up that networking piece. The biggest thing is getting that connectivity established, building that cluster within Azure, setting up an AVS cluster there. Now, what's really nice about AVS is we talked a lot, Aaron, at the beginning here, where we were kind of saying, maybe we have an application that's not quite ready for platform services running in Azure. Maybe we don't have the level of education that our employees need to be able to support it, anything like that. The one thing that's really, really important for everyone to take away from this presentation, it's so important. Just because you're running AVS does not preclude you from leveraging all of the hundreds of offerings in Azure. If you want to use Azure Active Directory, Azure Monitor, Sentinel, SQL Platform Services, Key Vaults, traffic managers, load balancers, you name it. The nice thing about this is your VMware environment is basically going to host your traditional VM, your IaaS type stuff. If you have a new workload and you say, you know, I want to start leveraging the actual Azure infrastructure as a service and provision VMs there, we absolutely can do that. It's very important to understand you can bring what you have today, but you can also complement it with all of those native services anytime that you wish. So there's a bridge there. That's what's really nice about the AVS piece. It doesn't, even though it sounds like you're running on dedicated hardware, you can still connect to all that multi-tenant platform services that we can run in Azure. It's really, really great.
That sounds really exciting. So when we're talking about some of these challenges, it sounds like you mentioned already that there is the ability to take that knowledge that organizations have with their existing VMware infrastructure, but now they can kind of deliver that same solution while using it in the cloud. Are you saying the solution is both cloud native and on-prem?
It's true hybrid cloud. That's really what it is. It's just
that's
true
fantastic.
Hybrid cloud. That's exactly what it is. We'll talk a little bit more about what we call one of the options. We have several options here at Logicalis, but one of them is being Azure Arc. We'll talk a little bit about that so you can kind of provide that single dashboard for management. Now, that's a whole different beast. That's what comes into that operational model. We haven't solved that problem yet, but we have some options there. But yeah, this is really the true branch into what a true hybrid cloud. Now I will say this. Anytime you're talking about Azure and you've already had a data center, you're going to have some type of concept of hybrid cloud. We've got to connect Azure to your on-prem infrastructure. We got to set up the networking. We got to get the interconnectivity there. We have to set up all the security and Active Directory and integrate those pieces. So I think the term hybrid cloud gets a little, pardon the pun, cloudy when we start talking about this, but it's kind of really defining how do we connect on-prem to cloud services and leverage both our on-prem infrastructure, compute power, routing, storage, everything else, and still leverage AVS, for example, or cloud native services and make sure they talk very well together. So we have a platform I'm going to talk a little bit about later on. You mentioned it earlier, our production ready cloud platform, or PRCP. We'll get into that here in just a little while after I go through some of the components and requirements for AVS.
So what are some of the requirements then? You mentioned some networking, express route for faster connectivity, and building clusters. I mean, what does that look like? Let's say that, sure, I'm a customer and I've got, the basics kind of set up. I think I've got a tenant and maybe I've got a couple of VMs and some storage going. What does this look like when I start to build out this VMware infrastructure? How do I manage it? You mentioned clusters and connectivity. Can you kind of walk us through that a little bit? What does a solution look like? Does it start with public or private cloud?
All right. Well, of course, you're going to have your on-prem infrastructure. So you got your quote unquote private cloud stood up there. So the first thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to get yourself an Azure tenant. Now, what we would recommend, we highly recommend this, and even if you talk to Microsoft, a lot of times they agree, you should go find a CSP, a cloud service provider, okay? That CSP partner can actually provision you your entire environment, whether for the Azure component, I should say. So you get your tenant stood up, and then we're going to talk about subscriptions a little bit later, but the most basic thing is we have to have a subscription of where VMware is going to sit. So in the middle, we call this thing called an AVS private cloud. The private cloud is what is the bare metal private infrastructure that you're going to run VMware on top of. By the way, you're not going out and installing VMware on this. When you sign up and you build AVS, when you add that subscription service, it gets provisioned for you, okay? Microsoft manages all of that hardware, all the firmware updates, all of the updates to VMware. You don't have to do any of that stuff. All you're actually managing itself is everything that's running on VMware. That's what's nice. So now we're reducing our overhead of what it takes to manage the actual VMware solution itself. Then that is actually encapsulated. So we're kind of starting from the middle of a circle. If we're kind of looking at this thing and kind of building our way out, that private cloud is the inside or inner ring. Okay. And then the next layer here is you're going to stick that stuff inside of a resource group. And those resource groups are used for you to compartmentalize those services that are related to a said application or whatnot, hence the term resource group. And then those resource groups sit inside of an Azure subscription. Okay, now I'm going to go through this in more detail when I talk about the PRCP piece, production ready cloud. I'll talk more about what those subscriptions actually are. Okay, so that's really what it looks like. It's just these 3 containerized boxes, and inside of that environment, a lot of folks ask me, okay, so if we break it all the way down, what's really running inside that private cloud? We do have a minimum of a 3-node cluster. Okay, so you can use the power of all 3 nodes together, but typically we would highly recommend doing like an N+1. So, you'd have 2 active nodes and 1 failover, so in that event, you can set it up in different ways. Okay, so I will throw that out there. But this is still where you're going to have, this is where vCenter is, your NSX, vSphere, all that stuff. It's set up in those clusters and it's all running within that AVS private cloud. Okay. And so there are some requirements behind this. So there are limitations. Like I said, the first real requirement is you do have a minimum of a 3-node cluster that you would be purchasing. Okay. We could go through that if we need to, as far as talking a little bit about pricing or whatnot. There is a max of 4 AVS private clouds per subscription, but we can have multiple subscriptions in Azure. So we can break that out. Okay. We can go a lot further than that. But you notice how I said you could have 4 private clouds per subscription, but in each one of those private clouds, we could have 12 clusters inside of that private cloud. That's a lot of compute power. Okay, so we got a lot there that we can do. You can have up to 16 hosts per cluster. Okay, now I know this math doesn't really quite sound right, Aaron, but it gives us 96 hosts per private cloud. That's the max number of hosts we can have per private cloud. But remember, again, we have 4 private clouds per subscription. We could have multiple subscriptions for a customer, not a problem. We could have 96 hosts per private cloud. So that's a lot. That's nearly 400 hosts per subscription is how much you could build. That's a lot of power that we could have. Okay.
That sounds like a lot of licensing too. What does the licenses look like behind this? Do I have to have something convoluted? Or, how does a customer purchase these licenses?
We can help you with this, because this is where it kind of gets a little tricky, because there's different things that we could do to keep in mind, that we need to keep in mind when we're planning this. I'm going to give you a small example. So let's say that we are going to use the Eastern US Azure region. Okay, that's where we're going to stick everything. Remember, we have a minimum of a 3-node cluster that we have to run. That 3 nodes, just to give you an example, we could use, there's a 36 core with 576 gigs of RAM memory, gives you almost 15.4 terabytes of flash storage. Okay. So that would mean that cluster, just to run the cluster itself, that's a little over $18,000 per month on a pay-as-you-go subscription. Now, you can reduce that cost. Okay. So number one, CSPs, they might be able to help there on that piece as your pay-as-you-go. If you know you're going to be running this gear for a while, you do have the option of doing 1-year reserved instances or 3-year reserved instance. So like I said, about 18,000 on a pay-as-you-go. If you know you're going to have this for a year, maybe 2 years, you could always do the 1-year reserved instance. And the price on a 1-year reserved instance is about $12,800 per month. or you can go to a 3-year reserved instance if you're going to keep it that long, and you're sitting at just a hair under 9,000 a month.
Okay.
For that reserved instance. So I do want to make sure that everybody understands too, that when you start using your cloud native services, this is just for the AVS infrastructure itself. But when you start thinking about, am I going to use express route gateways, which we talked about, that's one of the ways to connect into Azure is we would use an express route connection. Azure monitoring or a cloud-based scene like Azure Sentinel, for example, if you're using SQL platform services, anything you start using as a cloud native service, okay, that's going to ultimately increase your bill when it comes to that particular, those pieces and parts. So what we want to try to do is, as we're moving more into those cloud native services, we want to decrease the size of that VMware infrastructure that's running in Azure. If that is your goal, you don't have to. You can continue running AVS as long as you absolutely want. But, you know, when you have use cases where I just don't have the compute capacity to refactor my applications on premise, then what I have to do is start thinking about, okay, I'm going to try to decrease VMware and start leveraging more modern services within Azure native. That's fine. Now you have a platform to do so. But that's just one example of how that pricing looks as well. So remember, ancillary services, those could add to the bill. That pricing example, that's based on last month's pricing table right now. So that's fairly recent on that pricing example. We can provide links to the AVS solution pricing page as well. We do have all these links available that we can publish.
Okay. Let's say a customer already has some existing Azure services. Can workloads like this on Azure VMware Solution be integrated with those instances and other Azure services?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, you've seen some of these slides here, and you've seen it's kind of simplified looking so far from the different boxes that we have, you know, your private cloud resource group and your Azure subscription. But what you want to make sure you do is you don't just simply want to go out there and go, I got an Azure subscription. I'm going to stick this bad boy out here. I'm going to call it a day, right? Planning is probably the most important thing I can say, because when you look at an Azure build, there is something called a landing zone. There's a well-architected framework, and I'm going to show you a diagram that here in just a few moments, okay? But it's really important to understand you need to think of this as a hub and spoke type of model. AVS is not your hub. Your AVS is a spoke off of the hub. Your hub is the central controlling environment for Azure. And again, I will show you in the next slide, I'm going to show you what a well-architected framework actually looks like. But what you're going to have is in the middle, you've got this governance hub. That's what's in the middle. This is where you have governance, security, all your networking, your firewalls, your connectivity to on-prem, anything like that. You're going to have that running in that central piece, because that's going to ultimately hold things like Azure Active Directory, where we're going to integrate your on-prem Active Directory with Azure. It's going to have all of the key vaults for all the security pieces, all your policies that you're going to have, your governance policies, all of that stuff sits right inside that hub. Then what you're going to have is you're going to have spokes off of that. The concept being is, I don't want to say every workload or every application, but every primary group of apps is a better way to put it. It will run in individual spokes. Prime example, AVS, Azure VMware Solution, will run in one spoke. You may have SAP running in another, an EMR running in another. You might have a BCDR running in another, maybe a customer-facing web application in another. The reason why is we want to make sure we control access to these application groups, these spokes, okay? So if one spoke doesn't need to talk to another spoke, there's no reason to set that up. You may want to compartmentalize applications, okay? Completely different than containers. Please don't get that confused. I'm not saying that. But we're trying to build an environment for like applications that need to talk to one another inside of these spokes. So it's very easy to provision something off. So Aaron, you asked a great question. If I'm already in Azure doing some basic stuff, maybe some backups, maybe we're playing with a couple of application development stuff, anything like that, can I add this in? Absolutely. The biggest thing is make sure that you have that hub set up correctly. Once we have that hub properly defined, it's very easy to spin off that AVS spoke. Or maybe you say, you know what, this SAP workload is massive on-prem. I want to get it to Azure. Cool, we can do that. We can just spin off a spoke for something like SAP or any other workload. So that's typically how we approach that.
So, all right, that sounds really good. But what if I already have some spokes and hubs? What if I've got a customer that has a development operation in Google Cloud or has some sort of backup running in Amazon that they want to tie all together with a single multi-cloud type of management platform? I think you mentioned earlier on Azure Arc might be able to provide something. Is that what you were talking about?
Yes, it is. But before we get into Arc, though, what I'd like to make sure is, just make sure, though, before you have Arc established, we got to make sure we have that networking established. We've got the entire production-ready cloud platform. We got all the primary and secondary regions set up. If you decide that you want to go into AVS, you get all that particular pieces built. Once you have that built, then we start looking at, okay, how do we manage this bad boy? And you are absolutely correct. We have a multi-cloud management tool called Azure Arc. Okay. Azure Arc is it's a platform for us to be able to simplify your governance and management to multiple clouds. It doesn't matter if it's in Google, doesn't matter if it's in AWS or on-prem. This will allow you to manage your entire environment by taking basically your existing non-Azure or on-prem resources into what's called ARM, Azure Resource Manager. This injects it almost like configuration items would be. You're able to bring these in and you can manage things like virtual machines, Kubernetes clusters, databases, anything that you're running in Azure as well. Okay. You can use different Azure services and management capabilities no matter where they're sitting. So if you have a governance policy that you want to apply, you're able to apply that and things like that. Okay. You're able to use traditional IT ops and introducing better DevOps to be able to provision and support new cloud native patterns within your environment. Again, no matter where they're running. Okay. You can set up custom locations, abstract layers on top of Azure Arc enabled, Kubernetes, all that jazz. Now, if we take a look at that hybrid cloud management ecosystem, now this is an eye chart. Okay. I'm telling you that right now. This thing is a massive eye chart. But it's really important to understand, if you look at the blue box in the upper right corner where our production ready cloud platform is, and you see the standard stuff, this is basically, think of this, Aaron, this is the hub of our PRCP environment. Okay. Mm-hmm. This is where we have all the things that we talked about: Azure AD, role-based administration control, ARM templates, tagging, automation, key vaults, Sentinel, log analytics, Azure Monitor, you name it. And then all the different policies underneath, secret management and monitoring and logging and governance, that's all sit inside that production ready cloud. What we're able to do is with cloud native services, they just talk directly to, quote unquote, that hub. You see, so if we look at the blue dotted line to point down to that Azure native services, where we can manage Windows servers, Linux servers, all the SQL servers that are running within Azure VMs or SQL platform services, what have you. But what we want to provide is, if you look at Azure Arc integration, you notice what we're able to deliver: threat protection, monitoring and logging, secrets, change tracking, extensibilities, patching updates, automation. Arc is a platform that what it does is it takes all the things that we built basically in Azure, and it's able to extend that down to whether it be Azure Stack HCI. So if you're running Azure Stack in your data center, you can use Arc to manage it. And it gives you that integration to make it look seamless, like the same policies will apply, the same monitoring will apply to all the native things that are running within Azure Arc. It'll look like as if it's running in Azure. Same thing with anything running in vSphere. Okay, so that's your on-prem VMware environment. And whether you're running in AWS, Google Cloud, or if you have another hypervisor, it goes right down to those VMs and applies those policies. I will make a mention though here too that Azure Arc is actually in public preview right now for some of the VMware and AVS solution capabilities and what it can deliver on. I'm hoping to see that go GA very, very soon. So we're really excited to be able to extend there as well.
Well, you got me thinking about something. I see in this eye chart, there's quite a few different types of technologies. Are there any limitations on, let's say, guest OSs? What kind of guest OSs are compatible with AVS?
Well, so I will tell you, it's almost updated on a daily basis on what well, not a daily, but a monthly basis on what is supported. And so we actually have hyperlinks to the different compatibility matrices. So if we need to, we can definitely provide you with the VMware compatibility guide, VMware solution versioning. Also, we have links to what regions that AVS is available in, which, by the way, it did go public preview in the Azure Government Cloud on March 3rd. So that's really new and exciting. We're seeing a lot of traction there.
Yeah.
Yep. And there's other compatibility matrices that we can also provide around Azure Arc as well as what it's supporting and things like that. This is a big investment here with Microsoft on the hybrid cloud management ecosystem. This is a solution that we have. Here at Logicalis, we have others as well. It's really important you understand that there's several different ways to approach the hybrid cloud management side of the house. So we have to make sure we identify and integrate with the right pieces and parts. You know, Arc would be really good in some areas. There's some other tools that we also use where we'll integrate directly within Azure Arc or use something else to help leverage. So if there is a compatibility matrix issue, we can get you covered.
So in this chart, in a hybrid management ecosystem, there's some connectivity. One of the gotchas that I've heard about, especially early in cloud days, was the oopsies bloat bill that comes from I've just moved a bunch of stuff from and in and out and around in the cloud, and my goodness, giant bill for things that I wasn't expecting. The connectivity between these things, how is that managed? Are there going to be any accidentals because workloads moved around? You get this giant bill for all of the network traffic?
Yeah. So I'm glad you mentioned that because remember how I said planning is key to this, proper planning ahead of time. So when we talk about things like Azure Arc, for example, and what we're able to deliver on in there, we want to make sure that we plan on how we're going to connect to this entire environment so we don't have those gotchas. For example, one tool that, you've heard me say it several times is, we look at like express route connections or Azure VWAN, for example. Well, there's some new ways that we can consume it. Well, not even newer, but there's better ways of thinking about it. So we sit down, for example, you got metered and unmetered connections. So if you're metered, it's kind of like the old days of buying a cell phone plan where you had so many minutes of texting and so many minutes of voice, so that you're kind of charged almost on a per call basis or per text basis. Or you have unmetered where it's like we have today, unlimited data, text, and voice, so those kind of connections are there as well. I will say that a lot of times with the on-prem environment with AVS over an express route connection, okay, the traffic in AVS express routes isn't metered if it's running through AVS. But remember how we talked about if you use other ancillary services, there can be charges. Here's a prime example. You don't get charged for things going into Azure. Okay, so there's no ingress charges. But if you're pulling stuff across that connection, that's where we talk about that metered thing. That's where you're going to start getting those egress charges. So we really don't want to, we want to try to prevent that as much as possible. So we do some analytics to see what the best plan would be and the best interconnectivity for you.
This is pretty exciting stuff. How do folks learn more? How do they start sharing this with some of their customers and some of the people that might be interested in this? I mean, what would be your call to action here?
Well, I'll tell you, we specialize in cloud migrations, AVS deployments, managed services. So if you don't have the proper folks to manage this, we can manage it for you. We can migrate to Azure with AVS. We can help you with the cloud native integration pieces. There's so many things that we could possibly do. So with AVS itself, you're going to reduce the initial cloud migration risk because you're using VMware. You're used to doing that every single day. We got the flexibility with hybrid cloud management with Azure Arc and cloud native services integrations. We can maintain a lot of those investments you already have in existing tools, knowledges, processes, procedures. Okay, but you can still provide that foundation for when you're ready for that cloud adoption and modernization. So for us, the biggest thing is we want to work with our customers to try to get the right engagement and do envisioning work sessions and workshops. So we have a pre-sales team, very strong pre-sales team here that can help you kind of get what the best approach would necessarily be. We have plenty of different assessments. I don't like the word assessment, but we really want to work with you to come up with and develop that business case of how we're going to go to the cloud using AVS, what a PRCP build would look like, for example. We have governance and security and deployment engagements. We got migration assistance. And like I said, full managed services from simple things as, hey, I need better help on financial services and FinOps. Better things around my security operations and SecOps, monitoring. I just want to know if things are up and down, or, hey, you know what? We don't know. We need some help with somebody to actually manage this environment as much as possible. So we have full managed services, so we can assist you on those pieces as well. So you can focus more on your business critical applications and your go-to-market strategies and modernizing your apps. Let us handle all the ditch digging, the nice fun stuff of maintaining and managing that foundation of Azure and all the components to go along with it. So what I would say here is, if you're interested in this, I'd highly recommend you reach out to your Logicalis account executive. If you don't know who they are, you can reach out to myself, Aaron. Tony Fisher is our director of our Microsoft practice. You can reach out to myself, any of us on LinkedIn, via email. It's always our first name, last name at uslogicalis.com. So very, very simple to get a hold of us. We're very willing to help you out.
Andrew, well, it has been a pleasure to speak with you today and to hear more about this. It's been exciting to hear about not only overcoming some of the challenges of integrating native solutions. We talked about what AVS is and how Logicalis delivers that through a production-ready capability with AVS. I know I asked you about multi-cloud management, and you said Azure Arc provides that kind of capabilities regardless of where that workload lives. And then there was some invitations to do something about it. But there is a question that kind of came in while we were talking, and it's the question is around the support of AVS. I mean, who provides support of AVS? Let's say it's already built, it's running, the customer's happy, and they're running the workloads every day. But who helps to support that environment?
So it depends a little bit. So as far as like the VMware environment itself, okay, Microsoft will deliver that. They maintain and manage the hardware and VMware running on it. So if a node fails or whatever, Microsoft is responsible for maintaining that infrastructure. Additionally, remember how I messaged before that you can utilize a cloud service provider or a CSP to procure your Azure environment, which we strongly recommend you work with a CSP. They can help you out with that piece. They're the first line of support. They will be able to submit requests for you. Like, for example, we are a service provider here, a CSP here at Logicalis. We actually have a support agreement with Microsoft. So when you contact us, we immediately can get Microsoft involved. We can usually get faster response times, unless you have those premier support agreements, with Azure covered. So we can help you out with that too. So if you have your CSP with us, we'll be able to help you. And it's one throat to choke. You come to us for anything related to Azure, with billing, with anything like that. We help you with that piece. But if you're not leveraging a CSP, Microsoft is ultimately responsible, no matter what, they're responsible for that AVS infrastructure.
Well, this has been fantastic. I know I learned a couple of things. Hopefully our audience did as well. And I think all the questions have gotten answered, at least the ones that I see. And with that, I want to say thank you, and thank you for attending today. All of those who have had a chance to take a look at this. If you're watching this in replay, we'd love to help you out with some questions, with your questions rather. And as Andrew said, there's some folks that'd be happy to get in touch with you. Reach out, and we hopefully can talk to you again soon. So from us, from Andrew, and from all of us here at Logicalis, thanks for joining us today. Have a good one.